Well, thank you all for coming. Very, very appreciative that you'd find the time in your day to be here. Mary Alice McKenzie is to my left. She's Executive Director of Boys and Girls Club in Burlington and Winooski, and a founding partner with me. Bill Schubart to my right, old friend, someone who he and I have been having breakfast for a very long time, and we've been debating transparency issues for years, and would often agree vehemently, even over our eggs. And both Mary Alice and Bill and others participated in developing this paper, most of which originated from speaking with citizens across the state. Campaign for Vermont is in the coalition building business, if you will. And I believe that transparency in our government is the single most important issue that we have to offer you. We've written 3 large position papers and written lots of op-eds, and some of our members have written op-eds in support. But at the heart of the matter, there's no point about talking about issues around transformative government or a better way of treating people or being more accommodative to the needs of people, or even a sense of reallocating budget funds for causes both better with bigger returns if you don't know and can't decipher current information. The need for transparency is so profound that we thought we'd present it to you in this fashion, 3 of us today. Our piece is out, if not now, momentarily, and I think it's a well-researched piece that says a couple of things. It says, first, it is not hard to choose a path of transparency. It takes the commitment of the governor and the governor's branch of the government and the legislature to determine that this is a most important thing to do, just as most of the other states in our country have already done. Second, it requires a commitment to offering up metrics that make sense. So there's a goal, steps to reach goals, that certainly in programs, and a determination on a regular basis how well we are spending our money and whether the people in those programs or touching people are actually getting desired outcomes. Many, if most states, are already on that path in one form or another. We recommend a transparency authority, a group of people who would not so much impose, but rather recommend and stay on top of issues of transparency. Again, all about causing our government to examine itself, how it does things, and why it should do it differently or even better. And we say all these things because, again, if I might, we think and come to believe it's the most important theme we could offer. The notion of a 21st century society in which things are different than they were at a moment when the world around us is either less hospitable or going through profound changes, is a moment to reimagine government in a way that would require a commitment toward transparency and, if you will, a modern version of government, one that would both treat those who need a comforting hand well, those who need a helping hand well, and along the way be aware of how well things are going. So that's what we've recommended to you. It's an important issue. It's easy to say transparency. It's a word that in some fashion has lost meaning, but at Campaign for Vermont, we've discovered it's the essential ingredient for things we believe that ought to happen in our state. So should I turn it over to Mary Alice or Bill?
Sure. I joined Campaign for Vermont as one of the early founders, because of the need for focus on transparency. And so when Bruce said that he felt ready to talk about the transparency recommendations, this was a forum that I really felt compelled to show up and participate in. At the Boys and Girls Club, I have been very concerned to learn about the lack of transparency in big systems that we pay for that should be helping move children out of poverty. And I concluded that one of the obstacles was that we don't have transparency in these systems. Now, this is not because there are a group of people who don't care, who are obstacles to transparency. That's not the case. There are many, many caring people involved in these systems, but we lack data. And so if we lack data that we share with the public, it's very hard to know how to fix things that don't work. So, for example, I've learned that we have for decades judged our quality of our publicly funded education system based on our high school graduation rate. And we have celebrated having one of the highest high school graduation rates in the nation. But I've also learned that graduation rate is not tied to skill level. And I have learned that low-income children do not meet proficiency levels across the board in our state. I don't think that this is a system that we should be celebrating. I think that we should be talking about our data, acknowledging that we have a problem, sharing it with the public, and figuring out how to make it better. This was the issue that I was involved in, trying to understand how are low-income children really doing in our publicly funded education system. When Bruce contacted me and said, let me tell you about Campaign for Vermont, and let me tell you about one of the key principles that I hope to build this movement around, which is transparency in government. And so that's why I signed up. So I think it's wonderful that you're here. One of the guardians that we have in our state around transparency is our media. And so the fact that you are here today, taking your time to understand what we're talking about in terms of improving transparency is really quite wonderful.
So. My name is Bill Schubart. My name is Bill Schubart, and as Bruce said, we've been friends for some time and have had informal discussions over things over the last few years, but most especially around transparency, measurement, and accountability. It's a discussion that has really been around for quite a while. So when Bruce invited me to join his group to come over and talk during this session about transparency as a resource and a participant, I was very happy to do so. To me, transparency is completely a nonpartisan issue. It is not a progressive, centrist, or a conservative issue. It's an issue that should be of importance to the whole political spectrum, because it's only being able to measure and understand how well we're doing things, that we can bring to bear efforts to improve them, or understand our investment as citizens in our government. And one of the most troubling things to me is that the discussion seems to be just sort of a bipolar discussion on, is government good or is government bad? Our taxes are too high, they should be higher, whatever it is. And the third leg of that stool, which Mary Powell has talked about a great deal, is it's much more about how wisely are our tax dollars invested in the initiatives that we agree are the purview of government. Education, corrections, public safety, whatever it is. How well are they invested? Is there a culture of management? And I have to tell you, as a businessman of 37 years, we could not have run or grown our company, and I'm not saying a business and government are the same, because they're not. We could not have grown our company if we didn't have specific goals and objectives, ways to measure them, and ways to report those out to ourselves and to our employees. I mean, one of the most successful things we did as a company was share all our finances with our employees. And that vested them in our success. And I think that's the case that's being made today, is we need a culture of measurement and accountability in government. And we don't really have it culturally. People are stunned sometimes when I speak in public and say that in the spectrum of ratings of transparency, Texas is number one. And that's partially because of their press corps. And Vermont is near the bottom. Vermonters don't like to hear that they're way below Texas, but it's a fact. So I'm very supportive of this effort. I think it's vitally important. I think there are two reasons that are often put forward for not being more accountable. And one of those is, we're a small state, we all know each other. It's like you don't steal a car on an island because you can't drive it anywhere. And there's been enough embezzlement and problems in the news in the last year or two for us to know that that's just not true anymore. Accountability and transparency does play, and it is important. I think the other excuse that often comes up is that it's expensive, and it is, but not getting it right is much, much more expensive. And I think the third thing, which nobody likes to talk about, is the fact that measurement is a political liability. If you make promises and commitments that you're going to deliver on certain initiatives and you have a way of measuring them, report them to the people that you're accountable to, and you don't make it, the assumption is you failed. And that's the erroneous assumption. If you act on that data to take corrective action, but if you don't have the data, you can't do it. I've said enough. My thoughts are very much a part of this report, and I was pleased to be asked to join for this. So,
Thank you. Questions? Anyone? I would like to tell you that we're transparent, so you can ask anything you want. We'll do our best to answer it. It's a big issue for us. We've been on it for quite a while. Form of op-eds as an individual way before campaign for Vermont. Joined by others, we've managed to pull it together in one report. If ever you wondered about the value of transparency, imagine democracy without accountability. It ceases to be. And so if you can't judge those who would govern us or those who would choose, if they don't actually work for the people, and that's frankly through accountability is possibly the only way that's going to work, then it's not a completely functioning democracy. Here's our opportunity, changing world, changing time, to do something really important, developing a coalition on behalf of, thank you, developing a coalition on behalf of this transformative government, pushing our government to a different place, doing a better job with taxpayer dollars, doing a better job for those who require those dollars, and doing a better job in explaining how they do it. So with that, questions?
Where is the greatest lack of transparency at the moment, and how would you rectify that?
I think different people have a different view about it. Broadly speaking, there's nowhere in a consistent way that our government would tell us a set of goals, steps to reach them, and how well we're reaching them. So it's not part of our culture, and you can only, in the main, only determine it anecdotally. Oftentimes, that's not a correct way to look at it and may not give you a correct assessment. Agency of Human Resources grows at a remarkable rate year after year. They've had enough issues, actually, in your newspapers or in other media about things that they couldn't explain, whether it's case rate going up. It's a place we naturally look because it's such a large percentage of our population, and it is right there are people in need, whether for a comforting hand or a helping hand. And so we actually have recommendations here about how we would look at things, which is sort of a shared view as opposed to a narrow view of people. Those are the quickest responses I've got, but I think fundamentally our state hasn't committed to this notion of transparency.
Well, what are some statistics that other states are keeping that we're not? For instance, you mentioned the graduation rate as a poor metric for looking at success of education spending dollars, but at the same time, couldn't it just be that the graduation requirements aren't high enough? I mean, it seems like if the requirements were properly set, grad rate would be a great thing to be looking at.
I think that's a great question, and one of the frustrations that those of us who are trying to help low-income children succeed in the system, that we lack tools that other states have allowed. For example, we don't have authorizing legislation in Vermont to allow any kind of charter school. Now, maybe that's not completely the answer, but it's a tool we can't explore because we don't have the legal framework for it, nor do we have a friendly audience to have that discussion when we go to the legislature. So Vermont is lagging in providing tools to try different things, allowing the public dollar to follow the child. That's another thing we don't have in Vermont today. So a child who is going through the system and who may want to access technical education sometimes is treated differently because of the financial impact on the school district. So we do lack tools that I think inhibit creativity to try different things. Some states have said, we're going to give our communities a whole host of tools and you figure out what makes sense. And so you may have a publicly funded system right along with a hybrid publicly funded charter next to a private charter. And parents get to decide where's the appropriate forum for education for their children.
Do we have the population base for something like that?
Of course we do. Of course we do. That's always one of the things that you hear. We don't have to do it the way New York has done it. We could right size it, but the fact is that we don't explore it.
So what does that have to do with data and transparency?
Well, that's also an awesome question. If you organize a system around the needs of the person you're trying to help, it dictates a lot of different things. For example, if you say, all right, I'm going to design my system around a high school graduation rate, well then you develop a system that gets you there. But if you say, I want to know that every child is reading on grade level, and that means you have to know what's happening with the child.
We have testing for that.
We do not have testing for that. We have the kneecap tests, which are as close as it gets. That's different from knowing what is grade level and who is on grade level.
Where do you
Now-
run into privacy concerns with that, though?
You do run into privacy concerns, and you hear that a lot, because there are federal requirements to keep education records confidential. So I'm not saying that you have to make access to every child's name and what's happening. You can scrub data. It happens all the time. Information is sent to the Department of Education. There's been a lot of criticism of No Child Left Behind. Certainly not a perfect construct. However, what it did do was mandate the kneecap scores or whatever proficiency testing a state adopts to be made public. To me, that's the single greatest thing that No Child Left Behind did, because for the first time, there was a requirement to put some comparative data on a publicly available website in each state. But for that, we would not really know what our achievement gap is.
But in 1996 or 97, when the Vermont Federal Standards was put into place, weren't schools required to report on testing then to make that information public?
Not by my understanding, and you probably know more about this than I do, my understanding is that the definitions weren't set in such a way that you could really compare data. And so different schools had different definitions, and they went in. It was very difficult to gauge what you were looking at for data. The kneecaps are all designed so everybody's working from the same set of definitions, and so you can see it. Now, it is discouraging that proficiency in kneecaps is 50%, getting the answer right 50% of the time. So, I'm not sure whether we would all agree that those definitions are what we would want to see, but at least there's standard definitions and a standard reporting mechanism, so you can look at it over time.
So we have this standard reporting mechanism that has allowed you to get access to this data and allowed you to inform yourself well enough to voice this complaint that our performance standards are lacking. Isn't that the essence of transparency already? I mean, what needs to be added to that?
Well, I think a lot needs to be added to it. The kneecap tests are not even a reflection of what I've actually talked about, which is grade level proficiency. They are a step forward, and again, I applaud No Child Left Behind for making that available. Now, what is about to happen in Vermont is the system's about to be changed, and that is a move to the Common Core standards. And I don't know what's happening with the Common Core standards. How is that going to impact the reporting that's already there? One of the discouraging things has been in the past, the data gets changed up enough so again you can't compare it. So we have an enormous opportunity in Vermont right now if the public engages in the Common Core standards and becomes very transparent, and we really are saying every child deserves to be taught in such a way that they are on grade level. But I don't know if that debate's happening in public. I haven't heard it. Doesn't mean it's not happening at some table in some room that I'm not privy to. But I do think this is a moment in Vermont in public education to get it right. And I hope that you're all in the room asking the questions of the administration and whomever is going to be the new Secretary of Education to say every child deserves the opportunity, and how is the Common Core standards, how are those standards going to be very transparent so every taxpayer knows I'm paying my taxes and I'm getting the best outcomes we can possibly get.
Can you explain a little what your transparency authority would do?
Sure. I've got it right here. So we have, so we just merely made a proposal, and like a lot of our core principle on these ideas is we don't have the idea and we don't have the solution for a problem, but we think it's a mistake to offer up a challenge without saying, here's our answer for it. The definition of whining is to simply say, I've got a problem, good luck to you. So in this case, we created a transparency and accountability authority, representatives of 3 members appointed jointly by the Vermont Broadcasters Association and Vermont Press Association, 3 members appointed jointly by watchdog groups such as Public Asset Institute and Ethan Allen Institute, they have Transparency Vermont, and 3 members of the business community recommended by the government, by the governor, I should say. And so it's similar to a judicial nominating board in order to filter out political influences as much as anything else, and to set if you will, set standards for what's proper transparency. What do we need to know in order to find out if we're doing well or not? So in that example, it's not a study group. It's actually it would be a sitting group that would help set the standards for things. And its very independence, if you will, would ensure that transparency would become one of our state's goals. And through that, starting first with just to be able to find the information and then to present it to the public, even if it's simple stuff of who the vendors are, and eventually migrating to something far more sophisticated, which most other states are moving toward. How are we doing by comparison to what we expected? And through that, citizens, the media, casual observers can decide if we're doing the job or not.
What kind of a timetable do you see for?
Well, yesterday would have been a great time to start.
It seems to me that you could ask for some data set, or an agency or department could look across what they do and set up your transparency and accountability by program or
Sure.
by whatever, and it would take an enormous amount of time and could add to the reports that go unread.
Can I give an example of part of the problem and what one of the things this authority might do? And that is to define data. Because if you are uncomfortable with a flow of data or the data from year to year, the easiest way to completely obfuscate that is to change the definition every year. one of the biggest challenges that Public Assets Group has had in trying to trend analyze in their transparency website the Vermont budget is the chart of accounts changes every year. So if all of a sudden two things become one, you then have to parse, determine the ratio, and it becomes an almost impossible job. So one of the things that would add to transparency and accountability would be to say, this is the chart of accounts. It doesn't change every year, so that you can do trend analysis, and there are clear definitions. That's just one example.
Would you advocate, though, for what Nancy's suggesting, which is, if it used to be, for example, in the 2000s, during the Dean administration, partway through the Douglas administration, there were statisticians who were actually assigned to different agencies and departments throughout state government, and they actually did collect this data. Now, most of them, if not all, were laid off in 2009, 2010 during the recession. So would you advocate for positions like that being reinstated?
I don't know about the positions themselves. It's a good question, but almost certainly the state would have to invest in technology, which I think it needs to have a full commitment to it. I mean, think about each of our large sources of, if you will, spending. They're very large. They're big. Education and really, broadly speaking, health and related issues are a huge part of our total spending bill. And so within that, there might be a dozen or 24 large programs. Should we not find a way to measure them? I mean, somebody from government said, I just don't have the IT power in order to answer the questions you're asking. And my thought was you could have 8 or 10 people outside your door with a pencil and paper, which is, if you will, retro technology, and just get started on trying to figure out who those people are and what their needs are. Whether we hire statisticians or whether we invest in technology alongside if you will, a manual system, I'm not sure, but I think we need to do it because there's really nothing like today to get started on this. I mean, I can't figure out another way to do it, frankly, and if we don't begin to move down that path, I don't know how we're going to make strategic decisions in a period where there's a shortage of, say, federal funds, or the grant money's not there.
I think we've also, to a degree, gone backwards. I mean, in the Snelling administration, there was a strategic planning office that was charged with looking at the problems that Vermont faced, trying to quantify them and understand and planning going forward. And that was abolished in a cost-cutting measure. Con Hogan, when he was running the Agency of Human Services, came to the Vermont Business Roundtable, which I chaired at the time, and laid out 33 very clearly defined metrics for how he wanted human services to be measured. And he basically said to 110 CEOs, he said, I'm going to define these metrics for you now. I'm going to tell you what they are today, and if I come back in 2 years and they're worse, you need to fire me. That's accountability, and that's transparency. Those were eliminated. And I mean, it's not like we don't understand this or aren't capable of it. It's not rocket science, but it requires a cultural and a technological commitment to do it. And it's not going to be perfect out of the starting gate. But the goal, if we start to do this now, will be to look at trend lines in 3 or 4 or 5 years and say, hey, we're getting this better. The taxpayer investment is really paying off. Most of the people that I talk to don't hate taxes. I mean, they may not say that. They just want to be sure that they're invested well. And this is a way of rebuilding that faith. Because we live in an age now where 14% approval in Congress, rage against the government, and we need to rebuild that faith. And we're not, I would say we're not on that path in Vermont, but we've got an opportunity to lead, as we so often do.
When you say lead, I thought Bruce had said that most every state's already got all this. I'm not sure
I didn't hear him say that. I heard him say there was a spectrum. You can go to the Sunshine Foundation, which is nonpartisan. It's all about data transparency. You can go to the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. And there's a spectrum.
Pew Center.
Yeah, Pew Center.
There's no shortage of rankers.
And we're not we're in the bottom quartile.
So what are we lacking that, say, Texas has? What are these key metrics that these groups are using? Because I know they do have, I mean, we could be a D on one site, we could be a B on another. What are the key areas
Sure.
that we need
Well,
to improve and that we can do so quickly?
I don't know about quickly, maybe doing it right, and which is different than quickly. For example, there's a state that, a bigger state than ours, but also a state that's nearly broke, has invested a lot of energy and money in economic development, but they also provide remarkable transparency around their economic development programs. Theirs is more money than service. Ours tends to be more service-oriented, a little bit less money. But you can go to their site and find out how much money was given in the area of a particular metropolitan area, and then get a list of all the companies that received aid, and you can go further and find out what conditions were part of that aid and whether they fulfilled their obligations. Is that important? In a sense, it really is. For one thing, it's taxpayer dollars, and for another, it's almost always tax credits that they're giving away, or some form of tax credit. You would, as a citizen, would like to know that, if you were in that state, that the amount of money they're giving to, if you will, corporations, is well spent. Is that money well spent? Did it create jobs, or did it hold jobs in that community? And why is it this community received disproportionately large amounts by comparison to that community? It would enable you to ask the next set of questions. Could we do that here? We could. The answer is, though, we don't. Would you like to know in the detail of the Agency of Human Services more about why the caseloads went up? You would. Are other states able to tell you? They are. Would you like to know about the LIHEAP program, and if you enroll, and you're enrolled in 4 other programs across 2 different, or even 3 different programs, would you like one person to be responsible for you and your future? You might. It's not clear that we do it. Other states have migrated to that. It's not so much saving money, but it might be helping you. And along the way, it might make for a system that creates rewards for good management.
So has it in other states?
So what?
Has that happened in other states?
I think
Texas or whatever?
Well, we spend a lot of time on Texas, but there are a lot of states that have done a lot of different things. There was a state several years ago, this is dated by 4 or 5 years, you know, the governor and the speaker, the equivalent, went before the public to say they had eliminated a program, were eliminating a program, spent a lot of money in protecting children in the home, not because they didn't want to protect children in the home, but because they determined that it hadn't created additional value. That for the incremental money they've spent and people employed, the outcomes were pretty much the same as they had been before, and said in a fairly public way, we're going to go back to the drawing board and reconsider it. How to do it and do it differently. Could we do that here? We could. Does it happen very often? You would probably know better than me how often people pop up and say that didn't work. Oftentimes, you need to measure it to know it. And if you can't measure it, all you can rely upon is anecdotes. In a legislative process, that leaves open the possibility that both special interest groups and advocacy groups, those who would speak loudest in a more focused way, will get what they want at the expense of some greater good.
I guess what I'm asking you then, and I haven't read your report, I just got that. Do you have that kind of documentation in the report of other places that have done things as examples that?
We do, and we have some examples in here, but we also have referrals, so you can, like in all of our other reports, both footnoted and links to find additional information. You know, I think there's a limit to how big a report we're prepared to publish, but there are plenty of examples, and this is a trend that's been going on since I would say the mid-'80s elsewhere, for pursuit of greater transparency. I think its initial, correct, you may know this, I think initially it started developing because the governments themselves were beginning to say, we're not sure how we should spend our money or how we should better invest our money, and we don't have enough information. The natural curiosity of, did I spend my money well? Could I have done it better? Did it hit my goals? was that a good program or a bad program, caused them to reconsider and to re-examine how they do it. It went into greater transparency for citizens because they had the information and began offering it. Maybe under pressure, but probably because they had it, they might as well give it out.
I know this is a press conference, so it's not fair to toss this back, but I mean, it's also, I think, a real question for the press corps themselves. Is there a sense that what you need to know or what you're told can be backed up with data? That when a politician says something to you, that they are able to support that with hard, trustable data. And can you get that data? I mean, I think some of the best news organizations around the country now, like ProPublica and so on, are beginning to create data banks that says, you know, that is linked, hot linked to the stories. Here's the data behind this contention. And I think that's a really positive thing. But there's probably nobody in the state that has a better sense of our transparency than you all. And I'm not asking you the question, I understand that's inappropriate, but.
In terms of the metrics,
What would you like this legislation to include on January?
Well, I actually would like, whether it's, you know, form or process, when legislation is suggested, I'd like not just the name of the legislation and you know, a prose attempt at what it's addressing, but I'd like a defined metric for its success. How will we know that this specific legislation has achieved the goal, its goal? What are the measurements? How are we going to measure it, and how often are we going to report? Because one of the challenges that I feel is a real problem in government is that when something fails, we are reluctant, for political reasons, to call it a failure, end it, retire it, and try something new with what we've learned from that failure. More often than not, we build something next to it.
let's apply that idea of putting a metric in each piece of legislation that someone passes here. What sort of a metric would you apply to the end-of-life choices bill or pot decriminalization?
It's a good question. I mean, I can't go through every piece of legislation and tell you, but I would want to know that there was a blind study done of each supported euthanasia event by a doctor that was non-specific, like a tax return, that the procedure was followed, that it was documented. And it's a hard one because it raises the question that a lot of doctors will ask you. We're doing euthanasia all the time, you know, and the minute you have a law, we're going to be reluctant to do it. So, you know, but that would be the point of having a deliberative process where intelligent professionals who surround this say, look, here is how we're going to define the success or failure of this law. And then in 5 years you look at it and say the law has been a success by this measurement or not.
What is a success to take the example of marijuana decriminalization? I mean, some of this is a value judgment, you know, or is it, if more people are smoking marijuana, is that bad?
Depends on the, if I might, it depends on the purpose of the bill. If the bill was to simply decriminalize it, so you who were picked up at age 18 are forever not allowed to vote or get a job, or it stays on your resume. The idea is to expunge that, and simply done, that's what it accomplishes. If it's designed to do more, then it ought to be able to measure the more. Not everything is easily measured. Not everything is black and white, and not everything is going to come out to a perfectly even number. But I believe most things we do of importance in our lives are measurable in some way. Whether we do something as simple as buying a car or a new pad of paper, at some point you determine it was a bad deal because you can't write on it because it leaks through, or it was a great deal because the car starts every day, if that's your criteria. Why not? why not take some basic common sense approaches to this and say, first, it's somebody else's money. It's not that the state has its own industry where it just creates revenue. Second, there is purpose in telling people it's well spent. And if you're on the other side of it, in some receipt of taxpayers, you ought to know you're in a program that's the best that money could buy. It may not be enough money, and it could be better, but it's the best it could be, and as part of the program, you feel like you're getting a fair shake. It's equally true that when it comes time to making bigger decisions, this legislature at some point in the last session had to deal with whether they wanted to reallocate income, if you will, tax revenues to another spending source. The issue ultimately, if you will, was compromised in part by the absence of information. I don't think they could honestly say, I don't think any party could say that for all the money we spent to get at the issue of poverty, that we've solved it. It's a progressive state in a social sense, not a political. I don't mean in a political way. But we still have a high level of poverty, and generational poverty, and still have a high proportion of children receiving free and discounted meals, a pretty good proxy. And you could say, for all those myriad of programs, and for a handful of really big programs, are they working or not? And how would you measure it? There's lots of ways of measuring things. I think sensible adults can come up with an approach for most of those programs and on most pieces of legislation. Granting that there's always a great example of what the heck was the point of measuring that? We got it. So I think you can get bogged down in how would you do this and how would you do that, but for big issues, for important money, for the spirit of it, for the philosophy behind a small state with not a lot of people, it seems to me that logic is compelling. Tell them.
What I'm struggling here with is in the report, you spend several pages talking about how governors and legislators have campaigned on transparency as an issue for far too long without providing substance. And I feel like a lot of us here are feeling like we're lacking substance here too. We're hearing about how transparency would be great and can be transforming, but we're not hearing specific suggestions as to what to change.
Well, we give 5 pretty good recommendations.
I just gave you one. At the genesis of legislation,
Which is
part of that legislation would be the definition that you would use to measure its success and the reporting periodicity for that.
And I realize that's one example, but we've been asking to compare our system to Texas and what's different. And we've been asking, you did provide the one example, but I've been hearing it's a jobs issue. I've been hearing a lot of things, but I'm not seeing specific suggestions.
Well, I gave you one on economic development. Recommendation number 3 is criteria for introduction of legislation. A transparency board, if you will, that would be as nonpartisan as we could imagine it.
Does any other state have a transparency board?
Don't know.
I think another good example was what the Agency of Human Services did when Con Hogan was. There's an example. That could be done again. And you don't change those. You don't change the definition every year, so that after 5 years or 10 years, you can say we have more teen suicides or less teen suicides. We have more teen pregnancies, we have more adult suicides, whatever. But you pick your measurements.
But this gets back, I'm making a comment here, which I probably shouldn't, but it gets back to this idea that, Doug Racine recently told me that, it used to be, there was the staff that he had that could do that stuff. So are you suggesting then that the administration hire more people to make sure that we create these measurements and actually do the work of keeping track?
But I mean, sure.
Another question I have is Senator Ash has suggested, along with Janet Ansel, that every tax expenditure have a purpose. So this is part of the tax bill that passed this session, and the idea is that, in order for a tax expenditure or tax break to continue on into infinity, because these things don't get evaluated
Sure.
very often, a given tax break has to have a purpose. Do you support that idea?
I support-
Otherwise it disappears.
Yeah, sure.
Without a purpose.
I think it's a good idea. Many states have a sunset of 1 or 3 or 5, and one particular state has it at 7 through 10 years of virtually any piece of, if you will, not so much tax break, but things related to taxes. They have specific sunset, and it has to be re-examined and repassed if it
And
wants
that
to
was the
continue.
recommendation of the Blue Ribbon
Yeah.
Tax Commission, was that all tax expenditures sunset in 3 years and be reauthorized based on the determination of their success or failure.
So does that
Sorry.
meet your definition of transparency?
I think it's a good idea. Whether it meets the definition or not, it's simply a really good idea.
Should senior elected officials release their tax returns?
I think if they're senior statewide, you mean?
Yeah.
If they run for office, it seems like they should.
But I
Some-
mean, during the, say you have a third, fourth term, fifth term governor, should that person be releasing tax returns on an annual basis?
How about, well, I don't know, but I would guess every time he or she runs for office, probably should be a requirement.
Should that be state law?
Should it be what?
A law?
I think we do talk in here about the need for a comprehensive point of view about ethics and have an ethics committee and a code for that. I think disclosure of that, any potential conflicts when a person runs for statewide office is probably a dead certainty that we ought to have.
So that sounds like the governor would release his or her tax returns in even numbered years, but not odd numbered years, or?
I would say every election cycle is my view. I don't know if it's done differently elsewhere. I think that probably makes the most sense.
I would agree, because if somebody is asking to become a public official, that's a form of accountability. I mean, we all, their pay grade is all a matter of public record, but any undue influences on their income are important information for taxpayers to know.
But we have a 2-year cycle, so I'm guessing
Yeah.
an election year, because it's every 2, would suffice.
Which should be a 4-year cycle.
How do you counter the trends of public officials shying away from requesting documents because they know they could be FOIA? For instance, I know many of our statewide public officials no longer use email the same way they once did because they know they can be FOIA'd.
That should be a crime. You should
So
be
everything
required,
is-
you should be required, if you're a public official, you should be required to use the email system that is the official email system. I mean, this was a big issue
So I mean
nationally.
Stop,
phone
I'm
calls, though,
just
for
trying to
instance.
understand it. So they're using their own personal email,
Well,
is that
they're
what you're
making phone
saying?
calls rather than, or giving, pithy responses by email and then following up later.
Or using texting?
I guess my view is if they're in an official capacity, they ought to do their darndest to speak in official channels.
I mean,
How you legislate that is a hard one, though. I would guess it gets gamed immediately everywhere.
The federal laws are really clear on this in federal service. I mean, the Republican Party got in tremendous difficulty for using the Republican email system as opposed to the White House. You remember this. And I don't see why that should be any different for any public official.
So in terms of the metrics, and I apologize, I came in a little bit late, maybe I missed a couple of would poverty rate be one? Give some other examples of a metric that you would want to see, state program X meet. You mentioned LIHEAP. Should that be a case where, and how does that?
It may be in the question of life, it may simply be, if you just take it as literal, that literally, the program, making sure that a home is heated, and that there aren't people who fall offline. I think we were thinking so LIHEAP, you probably want no one to freeze to death while waiting for a delivery of oil. But I'm thinking in a bigger way. I can't see it from here. Poverty is at some place between, and has been for quite a long time, 8 and 15 or 16%. And there are a certain number of children who are on discounted or free lunches, which is a pretty good proxy for how they're doing at home. And we might, over some period of time, with programs dedicated to, if you will, not just a comforting hand, but a helping hand out of poverty, you might set some metrics like that.
Corrections. I mean, corrections is a good example. There's an issue now as we go to privatized corrections. The traditional requirement within a state agency is not required necessarily by law once that service is bid on and goes private. For example, if you all wanted to find out information, and this has been an issue, about the quality of health care in a contracted private prison, you can't find that out. You can if it's the Vermont Department of Corrections, because that's public information.
Do you fear that we're going the same route with mental health now that a lot of the mental health that used to happen, mental health services that used to be delivered in this big public institution, Waterbury, are being delivered now in private hospitals?
I don't want to get off topic because that's a huge topic, but in terms of accountability and transparency, I have huge worries about it. Because when you privatize what has commonly been, traditionally, right or wrong, a government agreed upon good and initiative, the rules change. And so does transparency and accountability.
Bruce, are you willing to make your organization financially transparent? I know you're a 501c4. Do you voluntarily offer information about where your money comes from?
We do. We do.
Is that on your website or?
I don't know if it's on the website, but anytime anybody asks, I'll tell them. And people,
That's not, I mean, most
Yeah.
state officials, if you ask, they would do.
yeah, but we do file, and so it's always on there.
Can we get that, the information?
Yeah, sure.
How do we follow up with that?
Give me your card. We'll send it to you, or some version of it.
A quick question about, so it sounds like part of transparency, the purpose of it is, I guess in one sense is to sort of measure success, but in another sense it seems like there's this issue of efficiency. We talked about education a little bit, the issue of efficiency, but are there any other facets of our institutions that would actually be replaced with information technology to sort of add to the efficiency of the system?
Maybe. I guess my own sense is that doesn't actually follow. But we might be spending our money more efficiently if we knew how well we were spending it currently. And we might make decisions that would have better results or get more money to the place it belongs as opposed to some administrative center.
I
Whether-
would say,
I'm sorry.
excuse me, one example that comes to mind is criminal justice. There are lots of agencies that participate in Vermont. They are not always very connected. Given the raging heroin trafficking problem in Vermont, it's hard to know what is the system doing. Is the system working as a system? You've got the U.S. Attorney's Office, you have the county structure, you've got sheriffs, you've got the Attorney General's office. It would seem like a lot of resources, but when you get below the surface, it's very hard to see whether there's true collaboration going on or whether you have silos of government doing good work in their silo. But could we do a better job if there were greater collaboration? This is a statewide issue. So that would be an example. If we knew, for example, just in the Burlington area, some of us tried to get access to data, how many arrests were being made that were drug related, and then what happened to those arrests? What happened to them when they went into the state system? So they went to the state's attorney's office, and then what happens when a case reaches a conclusion and someone goes into corrections, as opposed to what happens in the federal system. And you can't get the information. So that's an area where I think that there's great opportunity for data and tracking and judging and outcome measurement.
Vermont has over 60 law enforcement agencies, and we're not talking about local police departments. There's 60 different law enforcement agencies in the state.
Over the last couple of weeks, there's been quite a bit of coverage of one individual who lives, I think, less than 7 miles from here. seems to have really fallen through the cracks of the state human services safety net, in terms of, at a minimum, needing a lot of dental care, and just other tax advice, maybe some mental health care, who knows, but what does that tell you about our system, and is there a lack of transparency that should have been, people should have somehow been aware sooner that, this guy is out there next door to the governor, wallowing in his own squalor?
It's a specific, it's really hard to tell, and from my distance, it's miles away, I guess, in terms of understanding all the facts. You hate to see anybody who falls outside or slips down the crack, as you would point out. And my guess is the state is always trying to do better to track down people who belong in some kind of program or need help but somehow don't get it.
This is a really important question that you've asked, and really not to be minimized. We see it every day, people falling through the cracks. The system is really complicated. If you are someone who is trying to get by with next to no resources, it's a full-time job managing just where do I go for help. Because as Bruce said earlier, the system isn't designed around the individual, it's designed around an agency or a package of benefits that may come from different offices. It's not designed around the individual, and so it's really, really hard. I was on the phone yesterday with a mom with a child of high need, and she had to go to 6 different offices trying to figure out what kinds of services could she bring together to help her child. So it's a very important issue, and it speaks exactly to the core of what we're talking about. Maybe there are better ways to do things, but we have to be able to, what is the problem we're trying to solve? If we're trying to solve poverty based on an individual, what would that system look like around the individual?
The report also talks about bureaucracy and antiquated systems. Are there any in particular that stand out as one that was broken, and rather than reforming that agency, then had just another tacked on?
The problem is you don't know until you measure. I mean, you can have a $350 million agency like Human Services or Education or any, but until you understand what your initiatives are, the goals and objectives, and you have a way of measuring success, you are looking at white noise. You don't know. If you don't have that system of measurement, you don't know. And if you do, then you can say, well, this program, as well-intentioned as it was, simply didn't work. It's nobody's personal failure. It's not a political nightmare. It simply didn't work, because things in life don't work sometimes. So let's look at it again. Let's shut this down, take those resources, and figure out a better way to do this. It's not rocket science.
Mr. Lisman, I was looking at your membership list this morning on the website, and it seems like you've had more luck recruiting Republicans to your cause than Democrats, just by using the names I recognize from being a reporter around here for a long time. What explains that, and why do you think that not as many Democratic legislators, former candidates, et cetera, have signed up as have Republicans?
I guess I would contest the notion that there's more R's or D's. Frankly, I don't know their political affiliation, and I might have a meeting with them, or they might join me in a group meeting. I think the better truth is that we're growing pretty fast. We started with 3, and then 3 plus 20, and now we're at 600 or so partners. I think this session, legislative session, caused more people to activate themselves, wondering where to bring their concerns, and they found us. Frankly, if you look at our ideas, and our big ideas have focused on transparency, a question of energy, education, and sustainable budget, are, in my opinion, if you got into the specifics of the ideas, they're pretty moderate, mainstream, you could take issue with this or that, but we're quick to say if you have a better idea, we'll figure out a way to incorporate it, even adjust our ideas. I think people find are the fact that we're nonpartisan, that we stay away from parties, and don't get into the mud, and don't respond to what I think are silly things. Keep it up here. I think people have found that attractive. Whether they're R's, D's, P's, or C's, I'm not sure I could tell you, though I know a few who are on both sides, and all sides of that, who are probably part of us. On balance, it's people who I think our message has resonated with them. It explains why we've got over 3,000 likes on Facebook and, frankly, in a heartbeat.
But I mean, take healthcare, for example. There's some pretty critical stuff on there about the direction in which the state is headed, and that direction has been set by the governor, by the Democrats who lead the legislature. You're clearly being quite critical of it on your website. So
we're critical of the healthcare exchange and the nature of it. Frankly, it's a thing past now. We thought more providers would be of benefit. The state went in a different direction.
I think the phrasing was something about a radical departure from the ACA.
Well, it is. The ACA, well, let me be clear. Having just gone to yet another seminar about the ACA encouraged a robust exchange, what they call loosely a marketplace of ideas and insurance providers. And so the spirit of the ACA, listen, I've read the bill. It's long, but it's not complicated. The spirit of that part of it was to encourage competition for ideas, prices, and programs. And so the ACA, I'm not saying it's perfect, but that was the spirit of it, was to get all of that into one marketplace. We chose simply a different path. We argued that the ACA had some merit, and the state didn't go there. Still believe we should have. Having said that, the exchange is about to start. It'll have 2 providers.
I know Mr. Schubart's got to get to Virginia, so I think...
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm happy to stay behind and talk to you about anything.
Thanks.